Hello, I'm Will Yeoman. I'm CEO Writing WA, and welcome to another edition of Pod Street, Writing WA's official podcast. And as is often the case, we're broadcasting from the State Library of Western Australia, a beautiful space here on the first floor today. And joining me today is the wonderful West Australian poet, Rose Van Son. Rose, welcome to Pod Street.
Thank you so much, Will. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
I mean, it's interesting because you're one in a long line of poets I've had on Pod Street whose interests are so broad to cover the arts and nature, even science. And I'm thinking of people like Glenn Phillips and Chiniko van der Eyck. So to start with, your poetry is so rich in illusion and rich, and I say it's illusion with an A, not illusion, although perhaps you deal in illusion as well.
That's up to the reader to deal in illusion.
Indeed. So it's richly elusive, and it encompasses so many aspects of our lived experience. So it's very personal, but it's also universal. And I wanted to ask you first up, are you someone who's always had an interest in different aspects of culture? Because you have a very broad cultural background. So that's something that I really love with poets, especially because it brings that musicality and that richness of imagery to their poetry, doesn't it?
Yes, I've always loved cultural things, I guess, culture certainly, and associations. I think as we write, we actually we are our associations. That's what makes us, that's what we write about, My Italian background, I'm married to a Dutchman, my son's married an Indonesian, and so on. So we've got this cultural aspect. I've always been aware of culture and the beauty that culture brings. It really is a beautiful thing to know and understand and appreciate and love different cultures and what they can. And of course in WA and Australia we've got the Indigenous culture that we can tap into as well, and that's so we're lucky. It's exciting, it's wonderful, and I bring in all those associations into my writing and my love of nature, etc. So nature, history, it's all part and parcel. I grew up just in the Swan Valley, just outside Guildford. So I've got that Swan River aspect that just flowed. That was the end of the Swan River, really, the Derby Yerrigan. It actually flowed, big in the city, and it sort of came down or the other way, really. And so Fish Market Reserve in Guildford, my witness stand poem, it is really about that place, a sense of place. I think I have a strong sense of place. I'm very aware. I carry these things on my back as a shawl, as a cloak. So that's where I'm coming from in my writing.
And I really love Guildford because those listeners who aren't from Western Australia will probably not know that Guildford is one of those areas in Perth, one of the oldest areas, and still has a lot of its original, colonial architecture preserved, which is not often the case in many other parts of Perth. And those lovely sort of antique shops and, cafes and things. Right. It's a really fascinating area, isn't it?
It's a fabulous, but the old trees that are in Guildford,
beautiful.
The old trees, sugar gums, I think they're called, in the park there in Stirling Gardens. I mean, it's just beautiful, and you can appreciate that. It was going to be one of the Perth's capital at one point, Guildford, they thought of it, but it didn't. But yes, it's a wonderful place, and so from there stems. But not only that, I lived in the hills. I've got the hills culture, the Swan Valley. My father was a Vigneron, and I'm a Vigneron's daughter. My next book of poetry, a Vigneron's daughter.
Fantastic. I mean, it's interesting too because you talk about all those huge, such a huge range of influences, for example.
Yes.
And yet you're a poet, and poets trade in concision, in something small, in detail. So for you, I mean, why poetry?
Yes, that's a good point, isn't it? Poetry. I love poetry, of course. I love detail. When I photograph the macro, the tiny flower, that broadens from there. I see the small first, and then comes the big, the larger surrounding. It's a bit like the sun that has an aura around it.
Yes,
the sun's in the middle and there's the aura all around, or the moon. But yes, so why poetry? But I do actually write other things. People consider me a poet, and I am a poet, but even my essays are poetry because I believe that poetry belongs in all writing.
Absolutely.
Poetry is there, and if you really must consider that. So every line of an essay, for me, has to be not poetic so much, but literary in some way. It's got to have some some rhythm to it, some music, to enjoy the reading, so you can enjoy a different level of reading, perhaps.
I suppose that's the distinction one makes between verse and prose. I mean, you can still be it's all poetry.
It's all poetry.
It can just as easily be poetry, but you just adopt those different forms as the need and the impetus requires.
Well, yes, that's right. So I do love, especially creative non-fiction essays.
Yes.
So you take the real and you embellish it in some way. And you take the real and you extend it. And that's what poetry is. You take the real, a moment in time, and, you bring your associations to it, and it becomes something else. It really is. It is huge. A small thing can be such a wonderful space, a wonderful piece of history that you may not at the beginning have thought of it as such. Robert Frost always said, he writes to discover. Yes. He writes to discover something new.
Mm.
His counterpart, Edward Thomas, in England, they walked together in 1913. Edward Thomas, he wrote. They walked together and they talked as they walked, as poets do. But he wrote because he wanted to explain or examine the landscape. So he wrote for another reason. We all have our reasons for writing, but Robert Frost says, what's the point of writing if you don't discover something new about yourself, really?
You could almost apply that to living, couldn't you? What is the point if you're not always learning, always growing?
About yourself.
I'm very interested in what you said about it becomes something else. Or is it the case that you actually discover its essence, what it actually is, rather than changing it into something else? Because to me, there's a fine line there. I've always felt that poetry in particular, and you go back to this idea of embellishment.
Yes.
If you think about music and you think about ornamentation in music, it's actually trying to accentuate and bring out the essence of what is there rather than changing it into something else. Yes. So I guess we're talking about two different things, aren't we?
Yes, that's true. You're bringing out the essence of what is there, but at the same time, you're seeing it again anew. You're seeing it in a different. So it's
your perception that changes then, perhaps.
It's light and shade, which belongs in poetry, which belongs in all writing. It's the shadow and the underneath.
Absolutely.
It's just it's a beautiful thing, and you need to look out for these things. It's a sense of observation to create. You have to observe. I think all writers actually observe everything. You take it on board, and there it is, and you carry it around with you, and then you don't know when it's going to drop onto the page. It's quite a miraculous thing, this writing. It just pops onto the page when you're least expecting it. You think, my goodness, where did that come from?
It's quite interesting. You mentioned that about observation and so forth, because I was just reading some of Jem Nisbet's essays in her collection, and
I've been reading them.
Yes, and you might recall one aspect which she talks about her editor Stephen Schofield saying, "Well, a travel writer is a trained noticer."
Yes, that's true.
Isn't that an interesting phrase? Yes. And it applies equally to poets, or indeed any artist.
Any artist, I think.
Yes.
Even textile artists who may. I went to an exhibition in Kalamunda not so long ago, and a textile artist, and she said it took her 12 years to do this. And it was stitchery. It was just exquisite, And and she says she observes everything in order to make this one stitch. She observes everything, and so that really
it's almost this distillation, isn't it? Which again, poetry is all about that. So speaking of which, let's have a poem. I know you've got a couple of poems to offer us. What would you like to read first?
Okay. Yes, I will. So this poem I wrote, it's called Witness Stand, and it was actually part of Festival of Perth a few years ago. It started off as the Festival of Perth poem, but it ended up something else. And I wrote it at Fish Market Reserve in Guildford, standing on the river's edge there, and there it was, notes in my journal, because I write a lot of journaling, but I'll talk about that later. So Witness Stand, Fish Market Reserve. 1. On the banks of the Derbyl Yerrigan, I sit on bleachers, 7:30's time slot, rain stopped for the morning, river gleams, a gentle push, a man in a canoe slows his paddling, mouths, what is going on here? River usually his at this time. Trees tremble birdsong, cormorants in trio fly past, riverside. Close your eyes, listen, can you hear? Rainbow serpent, elders' stories repeat, conversation swarms, rivers flow. Spirit ears, long for late afternoon, witness stand. Women sing, hum an aria, adagio, legato, private time, open-mouthed, cantata, a song. I open, close my eyes, river narrow here. Dream, a recurring dream, a recurring dream. Someday I will cross the great river. I will call Marley home. A great egret shows off her snowy neck. Red-tailed black cockatoos shriek welcome. Women's chorus repeats a slow dance, strums triple time, another chord, cadence absorbs, waters flow. 40 cormorants, majestic black, skim river's surface, sunlit crown, wingspan, draws my breath as they return, sweep the river. Sacred symphony, ring next, follow, cormorants lead, rain clears, great egret poised to strike. 2. Upstream, an old bridge dips into water. The jetty I once clung to, restored. Gloom in young eyes replaced. Concerto, a wandering symphony. A harp, temperate flow. Water loops around the past. A canoeist stops. Fermata in an old language. Questions my intentions.
That's very beautiful. It's so interesting how you use those musical terms as kind of almost like recurring motifs in a way, and this understanding nature through our culture as well as memory.
As memory.
So
yes.
The cantata or concerto and adagio, legato, all these different wonderful Italian words which we're also familiar with music, but you're applying that to an ancient culture.
Yes.
Extraordinary.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. It is Marley. I should have mentioned Marley is Black Swan. Or call Marley.
So do you think that the aesthetic experience is a kind of a lens through which we can connect with nature? Because I always remember, I don't know if you know Vico's writing, he talks about, humankind can only really understand what they make themselves. Everything else is kind of beyond us. It's almost like Alexander Pope says the same thing, presume not God to scan the proper study of mankind as man. It's so interesting, isn't it? Because in some ways, nature is beyond us, and yet you as a poet are always making that attempt, aren't you?
You can't harness nature. You can't, but you can draw it in. You can breathe it in, and I think that, and then you can. I remember Edward Thomas. He wrote a wonderful English writer. He wrote a wonderful essay called "The South Country," and where he in England he was so looking forward to spring that he went to meet it. He went to meet spring. He started walking. So I'm going to keep walking until I find
a glorious
spring.
idea.
It's a glorious idea. You can't harness it, but you can love it and you can want it and you can long for it. This longing that we all have, and it's healing. It's healing. I do a lot of bushwalking. People ask me, whenever do you get time to write? You're out there somewhere. But if I'm not out there somewhere, I'm not inspired by anything to write about.
Absolutely.
You have to be in the forest.
You're writing all the time as you're walking.
You're walking.
You remember Wordsworth and Coleridge on those lovely walks they would do.
That's right.
It's incredible.
If you see a writer walking, they're actually working.
I love that idea. So what was I going to ask you too, this idea that in some ways, it's easy to forget we actually are nature. We're a part of nature. We're not separate. And yet a writer, particularly a poet, still has to feel that distance, that objectivity in order to be able to describe, to look on from a place of repose almost. And, you know, it's an interesting conundrum, isn't it? You have to be both in the world and yet kind of removed so that you can describe it.
And Mary Oliver says, if you're writing, just write. Don't let anyone interrupt you. Don't let the husband say, tea time. No, because that interruption, that break will break the poem. It will not go where it may have gone because, you know, it is really a central thing that carries you. A poem, as you write it, carries you. The first draft must always be from beginning to end, or what you think is the end.
Is it like a wave or something that you say carries you forward?
Like a wave.
And you shouldn't try to fight that or let anything interrupt
No. You can't be interrupted while writing.
Okay.
Not really, because it will be an entirely different poem if you do that. And at the same time, I think, you should welcome interruptions. Not in that, but you know, if you're out somewhere, you should welcome these interruptions because these interruptions become the standards of your poem. So it's a double-edged sword almost.
No, I love that.
Yeah, one relates to the other.
Yes. Do you sometimes feel as a poet that you are also taking up the challenge of trying to equal, if not better, what another art form is doing, or indeed even what nature is doing? I know sometimes I've felt in the past when I'm reviewing a concert, for example, I'm saying, well, I'm going to make this review just as engaging, just as exciting as the music.
Yes.
I mean, you'll never reach it, probably not, but at least it impels you, doesn't it?
Well, it does, yes.
It inspires you.
It inspires you. You know, when you see something totally beautiful, like recently, we saw La Bohème, and before that, I don't know whether you saw Van Gogh. Now, I do love Van Gogh. At His Majesty's Theatre, you know, the beauty of the ballet.
I missed that, unfortunately. It was
It was wonderful, and you had this flow. Right. It was just, and you know, there's Van Gogh with his brother Theo. You know, so beautiful. You know, you knew it was, but they were together. They were connected they were in life.
He is one art form responding to and being inspired by not just another artist's artworks, but his life.
His life, you know, and all his. And it was just exquisite. And so I could never profess to be able to write a review to do that beauty of the ballet that I felt, to do it justice.
It's actually impossible. It's like they talk about how do you dance about architecture, that classic saying. You can't describe it. I think what's important is the attempt.
Yes, it's the attempt to make it not concrete. Concrete is such a harsh word, isn't it? Concrete is the wrong word. But you know, as a writer, I think you understand what I'm saying.
So to make it vivid, present, I guess.
Yes, to make it a vivid present live. And that's what I try to do in the poetry as well.
No, 100%.
You know, that moment about the bird taking off in flight.
Yes, it's beautiful.
You know, but you know, to take off in flight. And, it's sort of just there. And there's a line here somewhere, you know. It's one poem, Black Winged Stilt, you know. You fly, wingtips perpendicular to earth. You fly, and the earth, mouth open, flies below you. I mean, that's finally when the bird is in flight.
Yes.
You know? And, you know, I do write a lot about birds. I've written a book on birds with photographs. And, you know, birds are my favourite, but nature is all my favourite. I mean, you have to, you know, if you know, what is a poem if you can't hear the flapper of wings? You know, you've got to hear the bird take off. You've got to hear it. It's all about poetry. It's all about the ear.
Absolutely.
I mean, obviously it's about imagery and metaphor.
So it's so close to music in that respect.
Yes, it's so close to music in that respect.
Or songs, because you've got the words as well and the meaning. So I'm wondering then, you talk about birds and how important they are to you. Is that you're fairly conscious of its being that classic symbol for the poet as well, and for the poetic experience, the idea of flight? Yeah, I wasn't sure whether that was just, you just love birds.
I just love birds.
Yeah, it's fine. It's okay. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yes.
I think about, you know, classic example is Keats' Ode to Nightingale, thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. You know, and it's beautiful because it's that constant
Yes.
Also, which is about poetry and art as being a form of transcending death.
Yes, it is.
And making one immortal in a sense. That there is something that survives you. Is that something you maybe think about as well, that you're leaving a legacy behind, even if it's modestly, I'm not saying it's a grand thing, but something that's important, a message that will continue beyond.
No, not really. I haven't really thought about that. But,
that's
but at the
interesting.
same time, I think, obviously, every writer hopes, look at Seamus Heaney. I mean, just wonderful stuff he's left behind. And
one would like to think that they're being read for many years beyond their own passing.
Because they were big prizes.
Indeed.
But, yes, I think, for me, I write actually the poetry I write first and foremost for me.
Yes.
And then if I share it at a poetry reading, if I read it, and, as a poet, I'm aware of the spaces, the silences are critical to my writing. Those stops, flies. The word flies is actually a long word. You can't say flies quickly because it's that type. Some words are short and then some words are long.
Yes.
And, and you feel that sense of flight, the movement. So that's really. But I mean, if I love to share my poetry in readings. Yes. So people, to read it flat on the page, sometimes it doesn't do a poem justice. If you hear the poet actually reading it and actually accentuating those silences, the quiet moment in the poem are as much of the poem as the words themselves.
Again, we come back to music then, because it's essentially a musical performance.
I should have learnt the piano.
Yeah, you should have learnt the piano. You should have stuck with those piano lessons. Don't we all think that?
When I was 12, I wanted to learn the piano. My parents were poor Italian immigrants. They couldn't afford to pay for piano. I didn't go to one of those schools where piano was part of the curriculum.
But you've more than made up for it. I mean, and I love that idea too of again, incorporating those other aspects of art forms into a different one, because that's what really enriches that second art form, doesn't it?
Yes.
That idea that you can bring across.
Yes.
I mean, what really interests me, what you said about writing for yourself, and so many poets and authors say that I write for myself first and foremost, and it is an act of communication.
Yes.
And if I go back to, say, the ancient art of rhetoric, for example, which was all about trying to influence an audience, you're not really doing that.
No.
Well, you're not starting that point, but you do end up doing that when you're performing your work.
Yes, when you perform it, you actually do. Yes, I understand. I mean, I understand about influencing an audience because
you want to move them, don't you?
Yes,
you want them to feel like you feel, or how you felt that experience.
And it's frightening, not frightening sometimes. It's quite, when someone comes up to you after reading and they're almost crying. I think,
it's beautiful, isn't it?
How could my simple poem have had that effect on anybody? But it is. But it must have had an effect on me in the first place to have written that.
Exactly right. Yes, this is the point. And that's where authenticity comes into it. You can't manufacture that, can you? If you felt that, and you're able to communicate that feeling, and someone else feels it, isn't that magical?
It is magical, it is. I mean, just a simple thing as a vase of roses. We stopped at a little roadside church between here and Eunorcia.
Yes, yes.
There's that little church in Bindu.
I know the one, exactly the one you mean.
One day we stopped and the church is open. It is never open, but it was a Sunday.
Wow.
One Sunday a month they have something there. So we go in, and inside, the lady welcomes us in. Inside there's a vase of yellow roses just at the window. And wow. As a poet, I was blown away. The crystal vase, the way it was looking out the window. It was just, and I did write the poem. I don't have the poem here. But, it's just a simple thing sometimes can really mean so much. And it was the welcoming nature of all those people who, I had to cry now, who welcomed us in, my husband and I. They welcomed us. And I thought, wow, this is beauty. This is nature. This is memory. This is,
And it goes back to what you were saying about those unexpected moments. You didn't know the church was going to be open. It's almost never open.
No, we were there to sort of read the gravestones.
Oh.
It's never open.
Extraordinary. Yeah, you're so fortunate. And to be able to bring that, to share that experience with us as listeners is magical as well.
It was nature and people and history, and it was all because the history was in the gravestones. in the cemetery. Mm.
Yes. Shall we have another poem?
Oh, okay.
Just for the listeners, we've got a small table here that Rose and I are sitting around, and we've got scattered across it different pages and books, collections of poetry. It's quite wonderful to see this.
So this is a little moment. We're talking about birds earlier on. It's just really a short poem. It's just a moment in time, really. And, down in Margaret River on the beach. And it's titled, Then One Blackbird Flew. Yesterday, on the beach, a commune of cormorants, sky-filled cloud, sun between showers, and how we crept by, trying not to disturb them. Beach, crimped sand, tinged our feet, but still they heard, turned their heads, then one blackbird flew, then another behind, then 10 blackbirds flew, black against blue, the sky clearing cloud at that time. And we were left counting numbers, the wings, the sky, taking both of us aside. We were left counting numbers, the sea, the shifting sand.
That's exquisite. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you. Just a moment in time.
It's beautiful.
All these birds suddenly took off.
Yeah. And again, this is what you were talking about before, about how you create something from that experience, something new arises out of that experience. I couldn't help but be reminded of Wallace Stevens' what is it? I can't remember how many ways of looking at a blackbird.
13 ways of looking at a blackbird.
That's the one.
Yes,
and obviously you've managed to compress it into much Wallace. But that idea of the birds, the symbolism and the nature and the movement.
The movement, actually, you're right. The movement must be there. You must be able to hear the flapping of wings in a poem. And if you're going to write a poem, you must. That's so important.
So that engaging, sometimes you want to engage all the senses, other times you want to focus just on one.
Just on one.
It's listening.
Yes.
And movement, of course, is essential to poetry in terms of rhythm, isn't it? And how conscious are you of the rhythm of the lines?
Oh, very conscious. Yes. Yeah, very conscious of rhythm. Internal rhyme is important, internal rhythm. Not rhyme, but internal rhythm.
Yes.
It's critical. It's everything, really. It's the music for me. It's the music I never had. As a child growing up, wanting to.
That's interesting.
Play.
So, do you feel like you're spending so much of your life trying to capture, or I can't say recapture because you never had it in the first place, but going back to that child who wanted to learn the piano?
Yes. Possibly, yes. Yeah. I was in a choir once.
Well, isn't that a
Not
lovely
soprano,
experience?
The other one.
Because that's communal music making. It's quite different from the solitary
but also
poet or the
encompasses
pianist.
the ear and the voice, obviously.
Yes.
But but I mean, imagery for me is important too. I want you to be able to see those birds take
exactly.
off. Not you, but me.
No. Us, all of us. We need to see that.
Yes. And there's another one, Black-winged Stilt, where I actually, the whole lifetime the bird is on the nest and it grows a little bit. And then eventually they fly, and the earth flies. I want you to feel that the bird, the young stilt is ready to take off the fledgling and just go and fly, yes.
So, I mean, we know from your poetry, but from other poets' work, just how much poetry can accomplish. Where is it sitting today in today's culture, today's literary culture, poetry? Is it very much alive? Is it vibrant as it has ever been?
Yes, it's wonderful.
Accessible?
Yes, I think so many people are writing wonderful poetry in Perth, but right through Australia. I've done a feature in the Castlemaine out of Victoria, Agitation Hill with Ross Donlan, and the poets, and that's the thing, Will. We're not West Australian poets. We're actually Australian poets. We are. We have to think.
Part of that community.
Consider that we're actually part of
Yes.
Yes, and to actually make yourself, this is where detail is good, but you have to consider, we're actually world poets. World. You know, the world is our audience.
I love that idea because it gets away from that parochialism. I mean, you do want to be unique and of a place and of a time, but you also want to be part of the global community.
Of course. I had 3 poems in the Glasgow Review of Books.
Oh, fantastic.
You know?
Isn't that wonderful to think?
There's John Burnside. He writes, I love John Burnside.
Yes.
He writes a poem about the Snow Queen. Now, what do I know about snow in Western Australia? Nonetheless, I write a reply to him to that poem. And I send it to he's Scottish. I send it to the Glasgow Review of Books. And not only they took 2 others as well, 2 other poems. So,
that's incredible.
So there were 3 poems in one. You have to think of yourself in a vat, let's say, of a vat's a horrible word, isn't it? It was something big anyway.
but well, I mean, and obviously there's the whole aspect of the internet as well. I mean, through the online experience, your work is potentially accessible to anywhere. Yes. Absolutely anyone.
Yes.
In the world. Which is not.
You have to
consider
yourself as a world poetry.
No, I think you're right.
First of all, you are, because essentially I do write about Western Australian things. I love Western Australia. To me, Perth, I do love Western Australia, and so there's so much here. As I said, there's the associations, but yes, there's the nature, the history of Western Australia is wonderful. Up north, haiku. When I drove up north several years ago with my husband, there was so much, and I took, you can go hours and hours and see nothing, but my journal is full to the brim of everything along the way, and there was so much along the way. That, the colour, the ochre, everything is just, and I think and I write haiku as well.
Yes.
I'm editor of Haiku, Creatrix Haiku Online. And so, haiku encourages you to actually write the detail, to see the moments, to capture those moments, because they are the ones that are going to become the haiku, or they're going to become the fledged out free. And
also the haiku is just thinking about that idea of surprise. That's the ultimate, almost essential in haiku, that you have that... the first 2 lines often, and then you have that 3rd line, which is like the turn.
Which is the turn,
It's the ha-ha moment.
Oh, my gosh, how wonderful.
And to capture that so concisely,
that's I guess, glorious. In a way, that the bird poem that I just read, One Blackbird Flew, that could have been a haiku.
A haiku, yeah, absolutely. Do you feel that and John Kinsella talks about this a lot, poetry as a reportage, as bearing witness to the moment, as do you often feel like that too, that you almost feel like you're or even a reporter or a journalist, but with a heightened aesthetic sense, I guess.
Yes, I do like to document and report, especially in my journal. I write notes to myself. They're very private, my journal. No one ever sees them, and I don't take them out of the house in case they get lost. To me, they are. And they become a resource. I was going to say,
they become a resource.
Record.
Yes.
And I can go back in any of the journals, actually, and find a moment that I wrote about and write the poem. It might be years later. Because that will take me back there. And so that I think, yes, and I do love to record and to share it with others as well, what I've recorded, the moments of, when I go bushwalking and find wildflowers. I photograph a lot of wildflowers. So you've got a lot in your repertoire as a poet. You must have, in order to A, get the associations, or B, write about them, and then be able to write them in such a way that other people, get excited like you do, or understand what it is, your passion. Because my passion is language, first off. It's really language. It's words. You paint with words. That's our canvas.
Beautiful.
And that's what we do, what I do.
Very, very good advice, not just for any poet, but for any writer, I think, in any genre. Rose Van Son, thank you for joining us on Pod Street.
Thank you, Will. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.